concepts and how we measure them. All right, so let's go moving from concepts to measures. So let's say we were interested in whether education influences political participation. We saw that at the end of last week, right? We saw that we thought post-secondary education was going to lead people to vote more. All right, so we do some research and we read this article. We find that one of the most widely documented research findings in political science is that participation in political activities increases as the educational level of the respondent rises. Among the demographic variables usually investigated in social science research, age, income, sex, occupation, place of residence, education has been found to have the greatest effect on political behavior. Clearly, the educated person is a different kind of political actor than the person who has only a little education or none at all. All right, so we have a good basis to make a hypothesis. So what would that hypothesis be? So, well, maybe we might write the hypothesis when education levels increase, political participation will also increase. In this case, the independent variable is education. And our theory is that, or our mechanism is that as people become more educated, they get access to the networks required to participate in politics. They might have more cognitive skills, and so they would then participate in politics more. So that's kind of what my theory or my mechanism is that's going to connect these two variables. I have a reason why I'm making this hypothesis based on previous literature. Okay, but currently education and political participation are concepts. Concepts are generally more abstract ideas. And first, we really need to define our concept. So what is education? What is political participation? So we would use previous research to define these concepts, not the dictionary. The dictionary is not a scholarly source necessarily. We want to use, like, how have other people thought about what does it mean to be educated? And this is where I would normally ask the class and we'd brainstorm a bit. Previous years, people have said, well, formalized transfer of knowledge, that it's accessing information, established institutional access to information. And then for political participation, we'd also want to define that concept. So it could be involvement in a community, seeking out information and applying it, acting on your opinion about politics, for example. So defining concepts is something that we might debate for the rest of our careers, but this is a lot of the political theory that happens, is trying to figure out what exactly does it mean to participate in politics. Is buying eco-friendly shampoo an act of participation? Anyway, so we first start off with just defining what do we mean by participation, what do we mean by education. But to do a study, we need to move from a concept to a measure. Before we need to measure the variables, we need to consider something called unit of analysis. And this refers to the cases or the subjects we're going to be studying. So in this study, we could think about maybe a few different research projects. One might compare a country's level of education and political participation. Another might look at the quality of education in different schools and how much their students participate in politics. Or you could look at it in the individual level, so personal educational attainment and whether you participate. And in general, though there are definitely exceptions, all the cases we're going to test need to be the same unit of analysis. For this course, we're just going to keep them the same unit of analysis. So, the way we measure a variable will depend on that unit of analysis. So how might we measure these variables here, education and political participation? Just ignore these columns right now. So for the individual, education could be something like self-reported education level. So I have gotten a PhD, I have a bachelor's, I got my grade 3 education. It could be years of, how many years of education you've had. It could be a test of knowledge. So I could give everybody a test and that would be how much education you have received. Literacy level maybe. At the individual level, political participation could be defined as whether you joined a political party, whether you voted or not, whether you made a donation, whether you've taken part in a protest. So there's a variety of different ways an individual can participate, and so we could measure each of those things. At the school level, how could we measure education? It could be the percentage of students who graduate. It could be the school's budget. It could be citations of their research, especially if we're looking at a university school. It could be a ranking. It could be the student average, if it was, say, a high school and you were looking at how they all did on a standardized test. Political participation could be the percentage of students that voted at a university, maybe a percentage of students who have signed a petition or have donated to a party in the last year or something. And so essentially any sort of percentage of students who have done these sorts of activities. Finally, you could look at education at a country level. So it could be the number of post-secondary education institutions per capita. There's a PISA score for literacy and for the ability to act on those literacy levels. Average level of education that people have, so do most people have high school education or just grade 3 level education or some college education? Likewise, political participation, you could look at what's the voter turnout rate, what's the rate of people who are members of political parties, how robust is civil society in some sort of way. So there's a variety of different ways that you can measure concepts, and it's going to depend a lot on that unit of analysis. Another dimension of measures we have is the type of measurement, and there's generally 3 main options. I'm simplifying it a bit. So essentially, a binary variable means you have 2 options. So it's yes or no, on or off, 0 or 1. So it either is or it isn't. Categorical variables are variables obviously made up of categories. So for example, if you have a Likert scale, so one of those scales where it's like, do you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree with this statement? Colors could be a categorical variable. Continuous variables form some sort of a continuous scale. And so we're going to be very loose about what we say is continuous. I do understand that scalar variables and continuous variables are a little bit different, but just something that you're generally able to have a large scale. So things like height, age, income, a pure continuous variable could go from, any, like it could have a range of any values. But, for the purposes of our research, we could say things like income or voter turnout percentage could be considered as a continuous variable. Anyway, so the next activity then is to return to the chart and think about what type of variable we have. So for example, I should have written these down, but that's okay. We're going to go by memory. So I guess one of the ways I had said education was, for example, let's start writing these in. If they did a literacy test. So would that be binary, categorical, or linear? So let's say it was a literacy test on a scale of 0 or 1. It would be a linear scale, right? It would be a scale that, a linear or continuous scale. I know that it's within a bounded range, so it's not really continuous, but it's still some sort of like linear scale. Political participation could be whether they turned out to vote or not. And in that case, we'd have a binary variable because they either voted, yes, or they didn't vote, no. School, for education, we could say percentage of students, different font, that graduate. Again, that would be on a 0 to 100%, and that would be a linear variable, continuous scale. We're going to treat these similar in this week at least. Later on when we get to quant, we're going to divide it up a little bit. Political participation. So at the school level, it could be the percentage of students who voted at your university, for example. And that again would be a linear variable. Country level education could be the average level or number of years of formal education people have. And again, that could be something linear. And a political participation by country could be voter turnout in the country, and again, linear. So let's think of one that could be categorical. So for example, individual, highest level of education completed. So like, did you complete high school, university, a PhD, etc. So those would be categories. Think of a categorical variable for political participation. I can't think. Another binary variable could be party membership. Are you a member of a party or not? Did you donate or not? Anyway, but I think you probably get the gist that, you know, and we're going to be treating binary, categorical, and linear or continuous or scalar variables quite similar during this class. So we're going to learn about the different types of categorical, binary, linear, and then also how to work with them. But that's for later. Okay. So now we can refine our hypothesis. So if our hypothesis earlier was that education leads to political participation, we can now refine that. So let's say we were looking at an individual level. So I might hypothesize that higher test literacy levels, test scores, lead to higher voter turnout. So this could be at the individual level. So if an individual has a higher test score, then they are more likely to turn out, or it could be at a country level, that a country and higher average literacy test score in a country leads to higher voter turnout rate as a percentage of voting age population. Let's do another one. At the individual level, maybe you could say having post-secondary education leads to more likely or higher likelihood of donating to a political party. Likelihood, there you go. So see how much we've refined our hypothesis just because we started to think about the unit of analysis and the type of variable. So this is the point where it is your job to try it out, to think of a way you would define a concept, how you would define how you'd measure it. And so I kind of came up with this idea that if the D Cadets gives you a higher pay, I don't know if that person's in charge of your pay, but if the CAF gives you a bit better pay, maybe your morale would be better. So your morale depends on your level of pay. So what do we mean by pay? Do we mean like all the sorts of things that you get out of it? So, you know, or is it just your salary? And then also think about how we define morale. You know, is that like how good the people on the peninsula are feeling about their life at the moment? So you'd have to define these, because then your definitions are going to make an impact on how you measure it. So if I was saying that pay is all of the sum of the different benefits you get from your job, then I would want to include salary plus other benefits that you might get. And then I would want to think about, for example, if I was saying morale was how well people are feeling, maybe I could do some sort of test of well-being, which, you know, maybe I could ask people, are they feeling happy or not? Or we could look at levels of, I don't know, like, how else many, like levels of participation in extracurriculars, maybe. I'm not entirely sure that's a good measure of morale, but you get the gist. So here, if we're looking at salary and benefits, maybe that could be dollar value, so it'd be a linear variable. Test of well-being, maybe we could say like, are you happy or no, that it'd be 0 or 1, or maybe you could say like on a scale of 0 to 10, how happy are you? and then that would be a linear variable. Or like how much do you agree with this statement? I feel really happy. And then it would have like agree, disagree, strongly, etc. And that would be categorical. Again, happiness does not mean morale, but let's say we defined it in that way. So fill this out, have a think. I guess we kind of just did it together, but spend a bit of time going through this. Maybe think of a few other independent and dependent variables, just so you can practice this idea of I start with a concept, I define it, and then I find a measure that meets that particular variable's concept. So in sum, let's just get this all together. Your independent concept is related to your independent variable, or sorry, your dependent concept. So independent concept related to dependent concept, meaning that my theory is what bridges these two together. But then we operationalize it. So this is how we measure it. Is called operationalizing something. And then it becomes a variable. So the actual way that we measure that particular concept for independent variable and dependent variable. So let's apply what we've looked at pretty quickly. You might have to like pause and go back and listen to this again, but let's apply this. And so this is going to be your job this week. Oh, part of this is your job. Okay. We're going to be looking and getting you up to a certain point in terms of wealth and democracy. And then the rest of it, you're going to finish off on your own and give your own example for the assignment. So let's take a look. Okay. So let's say we're interested in whether a country's wealth will lead to democracy. So according to the scientific method, we would first ask a research question. So does a country's wealth lead to democracy? Question mark. Okay, good. We got a research question. So I would do some research, I would see what's going on in the literature, and I'd find out that according to the Lipset hypothesis and some more recent empirical research, we know that economic development has an important role in building democracy. Democracies might emerge as countries develop economically due to progressive accumulation of urbanization, education, communication, and mobilization. So based on this, I might hypothesize, so I predict that higher wealth, a country with higher wealth leads to a better chance or a better quality of democracy. There we go. That's a good hypothesis. Okay. So take that off. There we go. So in this case, my independent variable, and I could write this in here, is wealth. My dependent variable is quality of democracy. Oh, it got very small. Oh. So I'm thinking that this Lipset hypothesis is happening here. That's my mechanism, because the quality of democracy is going to depend on wealth. So now, not having done the research, but you would normally go and do research, you would figure out how could you define wealth. So maybe I would say the amount of resources available in a country. Well, I guess it's just wealth, so just the amount of resources available. Could be monetary, time, personnel, etc. Personnel, there we go. And how would I define the concept of democracy? Alternation of power in free and fair elections, maybe? You can come up with your own definition. People have been trying to figure out what exactly a democracy is for ages, but you could read a lot of political theory and try to get a sense of these things. So how might we measure wealth or democracy? So I might say it could be GDP of a country. We're going to go at country level today because individuals don't really have a democracy, although that's something to think about. But anyway, so gross domestic product, It could be, what else? How else could we measure wealth? Average personal income in country, percentage of population below poverty line. That would be a negative demonstration of wealth. Anyway, but you can get a sense of some different ways that we could do this. And each of these here would be linear, or let's just change that, linear variables. What about democracy? So some of the things that the students have said in the past were how often the government peacefully changes, freedom of the press, maybe, how many protests can happen. Now the challenge with that is protests a good thing, meaning democracy is working, people can protest, or is it a bad thing in the sense that people are really not happy with their quality of democracy? So as you can see, I'm just going to cut to the chase, that measuring democracy is really tough. And so this is where I am going to dip your toes a little bit, or let you dip your toes a little bit into the idea of how we define concepts. So for example, scholars have come up with a variety of ways to define and measure the quality of democracy. So one of the ways is a substantive or a maximalist definition. And so that's really the quality and freedom to voice your concerns in government. So it's not necessarily just how you do it, but actually having that real freedom to voice your concerns. So things here would be like, can you actually have multiple parties that are actually running in elections that are open and allow for you to really voice your concerns? A procedural or a minimalist definition of democracy would look more at the process. How do we get people in power? So let's think a little bit about some criticisms. So a substantive or a maximalist definition, the challenge is, like, is anyone really a democracy? Like, does anybody do that perfectly, that everyone has freedom to voice their opinions? Maybe not. Where does democracy end and other things come up? So like, you know, at how much is economic ability to, you know, boycott or economic ability to engage in politics democratic versus, you know, more so just a different measure of affluence. Procedural, though, or minimalist ones, they look just at the process, but the challenge is that you can have a clean election where there was really no competition. So in that case, is it really still a democracy if you follow all the procedures correctly, but those procedures were rigged, and, or, you know, everybody gets a vote, but some people are donating way more money to political parties and have more of a say through that than others do. So that's just like one example of why defining concepts and then measuring them is so tricky. It's not as easy as it sounds, and you have to make clear decisions about how am I going to do this. And so scholars have come up with a number of ways of doing that. Like, there's huge bodies of literature on this. We're going to look at 2 of them, not 3. And you all have access to the internet because you are watching this. So let's take a look at a couple of them. I think I'm just going to go through this part with you and then just give you your own example as homework. Okay, so one is called Freedom House. So yeah, I'll get you guys started and then you can finish it off yourself. So let's go to Freedom House. So Freedom House essentially does an expert survey, so people who know a lot about each country, and they ask them a bunch of questions about freedom in the country, including democratic freedoms, and then they put it together into political rights, civil rights, and a total score in terms of how free is this country. So let's look at Canada. So 98 out of 100, pretty good, pretty darn good. And essentially what we're looking at is one of the ways that we might measure democracy is through, do people have political rights and civil liberties? Okay, so that's one example. So would you say, so the main feature is that they're measuring political liberties, civil liberties, and they're doing it through an expert survey of a variety of, like a battery of different questions about what's going on in the country. Now, would you say that's proceduralist or substantive definition of democracy? So I'd probably say it's more substantive, because you're asking all of these different questions about the liberties in the country. Now, it's on a scale, so it's a linear variable or continuous, not really continuous, but you get the gist, continuous variable. So that's one measure that scholars often use, and I really encourage you to go noodle around this website just to see a little bit more about how they go about measuring freedom and measuring the quality of a democracy in a country. Okay, well, here's another option, is called the democracy and development. I think it's actually democracy and dictatorship. I'm making corrections to my handouts as we speak. So the democracy and dictatorship, so this is done by a team of scholars. So if you go to their website, this guy's website, I took a course from him once, he was very cool. You can actually download the entire data set. And what they're doing is, here's the data set when you download it, is they're looking to see, essentially, if you go to column BQ, it'll say democracy, and it'll be either, or AQ. Here we go. No, not AQ. Which one was it? BQ. Yeah, I was right. So you go to BQ. Oh, it was already here. It says, is it a democracy? And it'll have 0 or 1. So it's a binary variable. It either is a democracy or it isn't a democracy. And if you wanted to go take a look at classifying political regimes, that's by Alvarez, Chebab, etc. I probably butchered his name, but they explain that for a long time ago, we've been trying to measure democracy on this scale, but when does it actually become a real democracy and when is it not? And what factors are key for democracy and which factors are not? So rather than using all of these subjective judgments, they make an explicit distinction between, is this a democracy or is this a dictatorship? So let's go back to our handout. So we would say that this is more of a proceduralist, because it's saying, are you having openly contested elections? Yes, no. If you are, then great. Like, your freedom of the press can be kind of crappy, but still at the end of the day, you are still a democracy. Because the other issue is, like, what makes a country that is 96 better than a country that's 90 on a Freedom House score, for example? Like, is there really that big of a difference? And so what they use is just a binary variable. Is it a democracy or is it a dictatorship? So this is one of the things you'll do for your assignment. You'll also have to fill in this here, but we already went through it, which is great, is to choose a country and compare scores from Freedom House and democracy and dictatorship, and have a little bit of a think about what are the different scores, and why do you think that they received different evaluations related to how they were measured. And then rewrite that initial hypothesis that we made up here, based on what your measure you'd prefer to use. So let's say I was using the democracy dictatorship measure. I might say countries with higher GDP, for example, which is one way to measure wealth, are more likely to, will have a higher Freedom House score. Okay, so you'll be doing this. You'll pick whichever measures you want from what we did up here. And then, as always, you'll have a chance to do things on your own. So you're going to do your own example. You're going to make a research question from the social world, what I already know about it. So what's my theory or mechanism of this relationship? A hypothesis, draw a diagram. So add in what you think your independent variable is and your dependent variable. Define your concepts. You don't need to do like a heck of a lot of outside research. Just give me at least a sense that you've been thinking through, well, what does it actually mean to be wealthy, for example? Think of some measures and then refine your hypothesis. So just like we did without the little tangent into different ways of measuring democracy. But I think the democracy thing is a good way of thinking through that idea of like, well, what really is that concept? And when you think through what that concept is, it makes a big difference about how you measure it. Okay, so for the assignment, let's see what